We have just launched our new forecasting report with the title A Time of Moderate Expectations, which gives our assessment of the Central and Eastern European region over the next 2 to 3 years. And here's Dr. Mario Holzner, who is one of the main authors of the report, together with Dr. Leon Podkaminer, who is not here today. And I would like to ask a few questions regarding some of the main hypotheses and some of the main developments which you analyzed in the region. Could you give a first summary of what you think are the main tendencies and the main conclusions you come to?
We can observe low growth rates of approximately 2 to 3 percentage points in most of the countries of Central, East and Southeast Europe. And compared to the euro area as a main market of these countries, there is a growth differential in recent years of about 1.5 percentage points. This used to be about double the size in the period before the outbreak of the global financial crisis. So we call also the whole report is under the headline of A Time of Moderate Expectations. So there is not a strong increase in these current growth rates to be expected anytime soon.
So the overall background of the analysis is, of course, the reduction of growth in the EU area, or at least not a very dramatic recovery, which we observe, although there is a bit of a recovery. And the growth differential of the Central Eastern European countries is maintained, but at a lower level.
So it is even worse. So the growth differential is now smaller, and the growth in the euro area is also rather on a low level. So and that is not going to improve very much anytime soon. The reasons behind these developments are partly also long-term developments, like a secular growth stagnation in the euro area. We can see that basically from the 60s, mid-70s onwards, growth rates declined constantly. And one major reason behind this is also a fall in investment shares. And this is also correlated with a fall in the wage share in GDP. So we think that there is a structural connection between these two phenomena. Basically, a lack of domestic demand, which is behind this.
So there is both a rather laggard development of consumption as well as of investment activity as the two important components of domestic demand, and competitiveness would show in net exports, but net exports are also developing less well in Central Eastern Europe because they mainly export to the euro area. Is that right?
Exactly, that is their main markets, and hence we can see that actually among the factors that are contributing to growth, net exports are not important, at least for the new EU member states. There are differences with regard to the countries in the periphery, candidate countries, potential candidate countries, eastern neighborhood countries. They have to a certain extent different problems, but a general feature is that household domestic consumption is not very vibrant, let's put it that way.
So the reason behind the weakness of private sector investment activity and household investment activity, some people would say, it's due to the abysmal situation of financial markets still. Would we take the same position?
Partly it might be still true that there is still the leveraging going on, that balance sheets have to be repaired. On the other hand, if we look at the behavior of the corporate sector and the households over different periods in the recent past, there's quite a change in the pattern to be observed. So before the crisis outbreak and before the peak of the bubble, we had a phase of, let's term it normality, where basically households were saving and corporations were absorbing these savings and investing. During the peak of the bubble, both corporates and households were basically just increasing their debts. And now, in most recent period, for instance, in Poland, we have the case that everything changed in a completely different direction. Corporations are saving up to 6% of GDP in Poland, and the households are actually taking credits at the moment. So it seems that availability of funds is not a constraining and binding problem for the corporations at the moment. Some are certainly paying off maybe old debts, but many are basically hoarding cash or actually buying foreign bonds or similar means of saving, and households are taking up some credits. That could be maybe a positive sign for future household consumption, but
that might then drive private sector investment, because at the moment private sector investment is low because the expectations of both domestic and external demand is rather low.
Exactly.
So in spite of profitability being reasonably good or having recovered, there's a problem there.
Actually, in some countries we see actually a very high increase of profitability rates over the recent past. So we would consider that private investment, at least in this period, in this set of countries, is not profit-driven, but rather wage-driven, in the sense that there is a lack of domestic demand, and firms are still waiting for signals that an additional investment into productive activity would actually pay off in the future.
And domestic consumption is somehow held back by moderate wage developments, which in turn is a function of the increased levels of unemployment, which the crisis has left behind.
Yeah, we can see a number of indicators which tell us that there is a lack of aggregate demand of domestic consumption. So one indicator is deflationary or at least disinflationary process in many countries. So we can see that despite obviously the energy prices falling strongly in recent months, it is also core inflation which is diminishing. We can
and if there's still a hangover of private sector debt, this is a problem of increasing the real value of the of debt.
This is in addition also additional problem. And as you mentioned, unemployment rates are still very high, or at least high, or in the West Balkans, for instance, very high. So that shows also that there is not a supply problem in a way, but rather a demand problem.
Now, a lot of countries have moved into had big problems with the current accounts before the crisis. What happened to the current accounts?
Yeah. Well, these are in the new member states. These are very low, the deficits of the current account. So here there has been a correction. Some countries already before had rather moderate current account deficit levels, and others were basically forced to reduce their consumption and hence their imports, and thereby correct the current account deficits. In the Western Balkans, for instance, you have still quite a few countries with quite large current account deficits, in a way still financed by some sort of aid or specific constellations, like, I don't know, in Montenegro, where a lot of Russian capital pours in to buy up real estate or similar special cases. But otherwise, not only net exports have been reduced on both sides in a way. Export demand from the euro area side is low, so exports didn't flourish, but also given to these weak consumption levels or developments, also the import has been reduced. So
you also analyze in this report the role of public investment, in particular the financing possibilities which the new member states have through structural funds. Can you say something about the role of
Now that is a bit of a relief, so to speak, for the overall investment development, because at least those countries among the new member states that were able to draw on EU funds, which is mainly co-financing of investment projects, both for the public and the private sector, were actually able to have some sort of investment growth in last year especially, but we expect it also for this year to still be quite important. They can still draw on the funds of the last European structural funds period. And some countries are better than others. So, for instance, Hungary was extremely successful last year, and there have been EU influx of EU funds of up to 5 to 6% of GDP. So these are quite important drivers of some growth in the region.
So before we come to the special case of Russia and Ukraine, you might want to point out some differentiation across the region, specific countries facing particular issues or problems.
Well, you have those countries which are doing fairly well in the center of the region. So Poland, especially Czech Republic, Slovakia, they have a rather smooth development. Poland actually never had negative growth rates throughout this whole crisis period. You have a set of countries which face various problems. For instance, high shares of non-performing loans. So this is Hungary, for instance, Croatia, Romania. And then we have a set of countries further to the east, such as Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, which are on the one hand influenced very much by the development of the oil prices, and on the other hand, obviously also by the conflict in the east of the Ukraine. And then you have also other countries which are quite different, like Turkey, for instance, that has a cycle of its own, not so much correlated with developments in the euro area, where actually the countries closer to the euro area, obviously their growth rates are very strongly correlated with development, mainly in Germany, one could say.
Mm-hmm. You also discussed the role of foreign banks and the position and state of the foreign banks in the region. Would you like to comment on those?
It is still the case that Austrian banks are quite important in the region. Austrian banks, especially Raiffeisen and Erste Bank, are in several countries either number 1 or 2 or number 3. The overall exposure of Austrian banks to the region of Central, East and Southeast Europe is about half of Austria's GDP, with the bulk of it being basically in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania. Only Czech Republic represents about a quarter of all the Austrian exposure in the region. But there is also in the more riskier countries, such as in Russia and Ukraine, a bit of an exposure of about 6% of Austrian GDP, or 10% of the overall exposure in the region. And that obviously used to be quite profitable in the past, is now quite risky. At the moment, it is important that the bulk of the Austrian exposure is actually in quite safe countries, one could argue, but still there is not only profits, but there are also risks. We
heard the story that some banks were very reliant on profits in Russia in the past years. So I expect with the developments in Russia that this could decline quite substantially.
This poses a great problem, especially for the Raiffeisen Bank, that had quite large profits in the last years in Russia, mm-hmm. and indeed that financed a lot of the activities throughout the whole group. So,
over our forecasting period, we are quite pessimistic about developments in Russia, but of course even more pessimistic about the developments in Ukraine.
True. We expect about this year a 5% drop in GDP in the Ukraine, and that might be actually quite optimistic. Russia close to 4% fall in GDP, and also Belarus about 2% drop in GDP. Obviously our hope, in a way maybe less than an expectation, is that developments on the one hand in the eastern Ukraine will bring us a more peaceful period, plus that maybe the oil price will rebound again a bit, and that should lead to a better situation in 2016 and hopefully 2017.
Well, thank you, Mario, for this overview.
Thank you.